Thanks for the introduction. Several of the people in the room are very familiar. I spent the last 10 years with the University of Nebraska working on water and cropping systems and looking at the impacts that agriculture has on our environment and our communities. And then just recently joined NRCS, and I'll talk a little bit about what NRCS is for those who aren't familiar, but looking specifically at soil health. So this is a really good correlation. We're talking about human health today. I focus on soil health, and so there's some correlations that we can talk about. And so I was specifically had met with Steve Benzinger over coffee and got to talking, and this came up. And so I'm going to give a very local context to this. Okay, so wheat is a worldwide crop, right? And wheat is a U.S. wide produced crop. However, I'm going to give a specific focus to Eastern Nebraska. So curious, how many people live in the east half of the state that are here today? Okay, so that's the context I'm going to frame everything in. As you move across the U.S., that context can change, right? If you're in the southern panhandle of Nebraska, there is a lot of wheat, right? And so just adding this to that trait and that variety is an easy thing. What I am in an environment is we're in a very corn and soybean dominated area of production, and what implications that has on our agro ecosystem and what introducing crop diversity can do for us in terms of ecosystem services. And so in terms of high fiber wheat, whether it's the current varieties we have now or a high fiber variety, to me, those ecosystem services aren't going to change, right? All we're doing is making a modification in the end use product, but in terms of conservation ecosystem services, the same. So that's a little bit of the context. So about NRCS actually started passage of the Soil Conservation Act in 1935 as a result of the Dust Bowl. We're now called the Natural Resources Conservation Service, so just the name change. But similar to Extension, because that was my role the last 10 years, we are all across the state of Nebraska. We're also a federal agency, so we're across the United States. But in Nebraska, we have 77 field offices with about 350 staff, including about 60 here in Lincoln, where I'm located. So what we do is we provide one-on-one personalized conservation advice to people who grow our food, okay? So that is small scale and urban ag. That is also large scale commodity production. So the realm of a 20-foot by 20-foot urban garden, all the way to a producer that might be farming 5,000 acres, okay? So in terms of clients, we make investments in those operations and in local communities. So we have a lot of partnerships with natural resource districts, which there's 23 in Nebraska, looking at even flood control. So for example, if you live in Lincoln, flooding is a risk. There's actually dams all across the watershed to help mitigate flood risk here in our own community. And we can talk about how wheat just in that watershed in Lincoln could have an impact. And then we also provide data to help policymakers make decisions. So we are a science-based, data-driven agency. We're also the home for the National Soils Lab here in Lincoln. So not just state, but we have, and our building was actually just dedicated here recently, just west of the Capitol. So about regional wheat production. As you'll see, there's different colors on there. The more intense the color, for example, this purple color here means higher frequency that wheat is grown year after year in the same field. Okay, so purple might mean wheat is grown every year in the same field, continuous wheat production, okay? To this lighter color, maybe wheat's grown every 5th year, okay? So here we're in South Central Kansas. I've also worked in that area. And then I also worked up in South Dakota. And so you get into Western South Dakota here. In terms of, we've talked a little bit about some of the different types of wheat, soft wheat, hard wheat. The area that we're in right here is hard red winter wheat. Okay, that's the bulk of what we're looking at here. The transition zone is somewhere in about central South Dakota, where we move from hard red winter wheat to soft, but spring hard wheat. So it's mostly when it's planted, but both are hard wheat. Okay, Nebraska lies somewhere where we would be in here in eastern Nebraska. So here's Lincoln, is our star here. And you can see there's a big gap. This is roughly the Nebraska-Kansas state line, and this is at the north end of the South Dakota-Nebraska line. If you look at that gap, It's pretty glaring, right? There's wheat produced from here all the way to Canada, but we have this big gap right here. Well, we'll have to contribute the sandhills, obviously, right there. But this is corn and soybean acres, and there's this gap. And we'll talk a little bit about why that's there. And I think opportunities for our ag infrastructure to maybe think about that differently, and also about the value of high fiber wheat, and already maybe not having infrastructure there and easy to even isolate production of that if that was something of interest to the group. Okay, in terms of acres, most of that winter wheat, again, the darker the color, the more wheat. So the highest wheat production just south and west of Lincoln in eastern Nebraska here. So trend, this was actually mentioned. I heard somebody mention, but we're going to go back to the 1960s, I think same time frame that Rod had mentioned. And this is winter wheat planted acres in Nebraska across the 3 USDA crop reporting districts. So in blue here is Northeast, East Central, Southeast districts 3, 6, and 9. And so red and green here is Southeast and East Central Nebraska. We were over 500,000 acres of wheat in 1960. And we're all the way down to about 30,000 acres here in eastern Nebraska, fast forwarding to today. What's unique about this is what you'll notice, and this goes into the next figure. Northeast Nebraska, production in 1960s, fairly similar to where we're at today. So winter wheat was never grown. And the main reason for that was winter hardiness, okay? So we didn't have the varieties back then that would reliably overwinter. Steve Benzinger and other wheat breeders have worked very hard and made that no longer really a challenge for us. If we look at wheat production, Southeast, South Dakota, which I don't have on the figure, but I have on this little orange line, they hardly had any wheat in Southeast South Dakota, and it's actually gone up. So what happened there is they were growing spring wheat. With the introduction of winter wheat that was winter hardy, they now plant winter wheat in Southeast South Dakota. In terms of yield, they're one of the highest yielding areas for rain-fed winter wheat production is actually Southeast South Dakota, if you look at the Great Plains, with over like 70 bushel for a crop district average, okay? So we can grow really good wheat. I work with farmers over the last 10 years. Last year, I probably had about 200 questions when I was with UNL on wheat just across eastern Nebraska. Growers are interested. They have questions. There's wheat growers up here. This last year, their farm average, a guy in Thurston County, over 100 bushels an acre across his 300 acres of wheat he had. So we have the yield potential, but there is something missing. This is location of grain elevators where farmers can haul their wheat to. So where they can deliver their semi-load of wheat. So if we look here in Lincoln, we have lots of options in Lancaster County, ADM, Farmers Co-op, Frontier just in Lancaster County. But if you look at Northeast Nebraska, well, you're like, why would there be a grain elevator there? Grains that winter wheat's not grown. But which one is it now? Before it was a genetic winter hardiness issue. Now it's an infrastructure issue. I know growers up here near Norfolk, and they're like, hey, Nathan, I want to grow wheat, but I can't walk up somebody 3 hours in a semi to drive all the way down to Fremont or up to South Dakota, right? So it's a chicken and egg thing. I'm not sure. If you build it, will they come? I don't know, right? But that is, I know one barrier that farmers have been telling me why they aren't adding this crop to the rotation is literally, and we'll talk about barriers to adoption in a study that was done in the region. So my area that I focus on is soil health. So that goes beyond just crop rotation, and we'll talk about some other things, but there's 4 main principles when we talk about soil health. And the same thing could be true of human health. And I'm sure some of you could go over some basic principles as well. For soil health, it's minimizing disturbance. So that means less tillage. It could be less foot traffic, whatever it might be. Wheel traffic, if you have a lawn or garden, where does your grass struggle? Where you walk most, right? And that's due to compaction. Same thing on farmers' fields, minimizing disturbance. The other thing that we need when we talk about protecting soil health, and then we'll talk about feeding it. So some correlations today, right? We need to protect things, and then we need to improve the health. Just we can maintain our soil health or protect it, minimizing disturbance, and then maximizing soil cover. So microorganisms need that cover. It's a microbial hotspot. Our soils are alive. They're an ecosystem, and there's a food chain just like there is above ground, okay? So there's predator prey. We need that. That also regulates that microclimate. the exchange of water at the soil surface, for example, protecting it from erosion. And so farmers have done a fantastic job over the last 50 years of really transitioning to limited, minimal, or no-till. So we're about over 70% adoption in Nebraska of minimal or no tillage, okay? So we've made great strides there. The other component, I think, where there's still room for opportunities in crop production here in Nebraska is feeding our soil biology, improving resilience of our soils and our operations, and improving soil organic matter or soil organic carbon. Carbon's a big topic lately. So if you want to use those interchangeably, it's roughly a conversion, but soil organic carbon. One is maximizing living roots, and we'll talk about this. When I said feeding biology, what do microorganisms need? They need some of the same things we need. They need sugars, carbohydrates. They need food sources, right? And root exudates, what roots kick off theirs are some of those sources. So if we don't have roots growing, we don't have one of their staple food sources. There's months of the year, like right now, corn and soybeans have already been harvested. If you look and drive across the country, there could be something growing there, green with living roots that could be feeding that biology. Okay, the other one is maximizing biodiversity. So my definition of biodiversity might be different than yours, but growing just corn and soybeans, and I have a farm myself and grew up here in eastern Nebraska, but corn and soybeans is pretty limited in terms of biodiversity. You're growing 2 species in 2 years, okay? And that's how our agriculture, if you think about the efficiency of it, though, we've done 2 things really well, right? And so we've been able to produce those crops reliably, consistently, in an efficient manner that's affordable, like we talked in terms of a food source. But there's opportunities to mimic Mother Nature in terms of a natural ecosystem. I'm never going to say that an agro-ecosystem and a natural ecosystem are one and the same. They have, if you want a small amount of food, we could mimic a natural ecosystem, but we need to feed the world. And so an agro-ecosystem, it is about production at the end of the day, right? Producing a commodity food. And so, but there is room to get a little bit closer to what Mother Nature did in terms of the native prairie, where we had hundreds of species to maximize biodiversity here. And so one of those is called conservation crop rotation, or for example, here in eastern Nebraska, adding wheat to the corn and soybean rotation. Another one that's picked up in terms of adoption that adds actually feeding, that kind of checks this box, are cover crops, which have been much more talked about. And the adoption of cover crops in Nebraska is about on 7% of the acres in Nebraska based on satellite imagery. So we've been improving, but at a pretty slow pace relative probably to the speed at which we picked up in terms of no-till. And there's reasons for that when we get into water use and demand when we move east to west in Nebraska. So I'm not going to go over all these studies because I had 15 minutes, but I just wanted to read some of the titles of recent publications that's coming out of academia. So I actually know Marshall McDaniel. He was a speaker for us a few years ago at a soil health conference here in eastern Nebraska. He's over in Iowa. He recently actually tested those 4 soil health principles that NRCS uses. And we put those into place in 2010, have refined those to the 4 principles, but no one actually tested all 4 principles. Are they additive? So if I protect the soil and feed the soil, and is my soil health going to keep going up? So is 1 + 2 + 3, is that a linear improvement in soil health? And the answer was yes. So if you have no-till, if you have cover crops and diverse crop rotation, you're improving soil health with the adoption of each one of those practices. Next one. So that was putting soil health principles to the test in Iowa. The next one, reduced tillage and rotational diversity, improve soil health in Missouri. Love this study. Over 5,000 fields, farmers' fields, were looked at in this study. So not small plot research at the university research farm, but taking samples, and showed that there was improvements in soil health with no-till. Confirmed again, over and over again. But they also looked at crop diversity and found the same thing, that when there was more than 3 or more crops in that rotation, there were improvements in soil health as well. Not as much as no-till, but getting pretty close. Long-term rotation diversity and nitrogen effects on soil organic carbon and nitrogen stocks. Okay, in terms of that, the carbon sequestration, ecosystem services, opportunities there. The other one, crop rotation till effects on soil physical and chemical properties. When we talk about soil health, there's physical properties chemical properties and biological properties we can look at to measure soil health. And one of the ones they quantified here was an improvement in soil physical health, or a term called aggregate stability, which is an improvement of that soil structure. Okay, components of a crop rotation. Okay, components missing in a corn soybean rotation. Again, farmers, corn in this field this year, next year they'll plant soybeans and vice versa. That's the dominant crop rotation. There's variations of that, of course. But crop intensity is the number of crops in a set number of years. So if I did corn, soybean, wheat, and did a double crop soybean, so planting soybeans right after wheat harvest, that would be one way to increase the crop intensity. One of those years I actually produced 2 crops, right? So I increased it over 1 crop in 1 year. Years separating the same crop type. We don't have that. So crop type would be a warm season annual grass crop. So corn, grain, sorghum would be the same crop type. Soybeans are a warm season broadleaf. Soybeans are. Sunflowers would be the same crop type. A cool season grass would be winter wheat, rye, barley, for example. And then we have cool season broadleaves, which are few and far between in this part of Nebraska. An example would be field peas or split pea soup, for example, right? Of a cool season broadleaf. Okay, we don't, with corn and soybeans, we only have 2 of those 4 crop types. Utilizing both grass and broadleaf crops, yes, there should be a check mark there. I think it's kind of hard to see, but we have both of those in our current crop rotation. Having both spring and fall planted crops, no, we have all spring planted crops if we're in corn, soybean. In presence of warm and cool season crops, no. In corn and soybean rotation, we just have warm season crops. So one way to do that, and I'm not expecting or would never expect every farmer in eastern Nebraska to have wheat. I think that's unrealistic, right? All the farmers that are small business owners, they make their own decisions for their own operation. But if we wanted a modest increase in wheat, for example, if a farmer was interested in not shifting too much from the 50% corn and soybeans and adding 20% wheat to their operation, there's a couple different rotations. And we, just with adding that in that 5-year cycle, would have, say, we checked all the boxes of what we want for a crop rotation. With the addition of just winter wheat. So corn, soybean, wheat, soybean would be a 5-year rotation for farmers in the room. Same thing, corn, soybean, wheat. So there's different ways to include that. Myself on my field up by Fremont, I have corn, soybean, wheat. I have it every 3rd year on part of the farm. So profitability was something that was brought up, right? Profitability of a commodity to a farmer. So is there some profitability of adding wheat? This was a study done by a former extension educator, Paul Hay, down in Gage County. He looked at nearly 3,000 fields in southeast Nebraska from 1994 through 2007, surveying farmers, what were your yields and what was your previous crop? Okay, so essentially getting at crop rotation is what he was looking at. So a great data set. He was interested in that crop rotation response. What's the best crop rotation? Seeking answers to common questions. So let's look at crop rotation. We talked a lot about that corn soybean rotation. So just on no-till fields, there's 364 fields that he collected farmer data from. The average yield, and you got to remember, this is almost over 20 years ago. Yields have improved a lot with genetic improvements in corn and soybeans, but 108 bushel. For farmers that had corn after wheat, the average was 126. So an 18 bushel increase with wheat in rotation to the corn, okay? Look at soybeans. Soybeans following corn, 39 bushel soybeans. Soybeans following wheat, 42. So about a 3 bushel. In terms of regional studies, this kind of falls within the realm of what we expect for yield benefit. What I tell farmers is a 3 bushel advantage on soybeans and about a 10 bushel advantage on corn, because corn drought tolerance has improved a lot. Second, we do have some long-term crop rotation studies over in Illinois where water isn't as much of a limiting factor in terms of crop production. That's what they found. 3 bushel better in soybeans, 10 bushel better in corn with wheat in the rotation over corn and soybeans. Rod said I'd talk about resilience, okay? If we were to take crop insurance away today, there'd be a lot of nervous farmers. I'd be nervous too. I just took out my crop insurance policy for my wheat next year already, right? It's a risk management, and that is subsidized by taxpayer dollars. I don't pay on my crop insurance 100% of the premium. It's reduced, okay? But I need that there. What happens if it hails in June? Hails the crop to the ground. It's going to get my wheat, my corn, and my soybeans, right? So there's certain weather, extreme weather events that's going to damage everything. But drought is what I want to talk about. Nebraska's been in a long-term drought for most of the summer. That's changed a lot lately with the recent rains, at least in parts of the state. When do crops need water? If we look at crop water use, corn peak water use is in July. So if we don't have rain in July for the whole month, we're going to run into implications on reducing the corn yield that farmers see. Soybeans, the month is about August. If we don't have rain in August, dry land, rain-fed soybeans are going to struggle. Guess what? In July and August, wheat doesn't care. Wheat's not even growing, right? Wheat, we plant in the fall, harvest usually about midsummer. But if we have a dry fall, if we had hardly any rain in September, October, November, we'll run into issues with stand or yield potential. Luckily, that's turned around. So what I'm saying is by inherently growing one of those different crop types, a cool season species, we've shifted when we need water, and we've what? Inherently mitigated our risk to a short-term drought without crop insurance. But again, crop insurance doesn't cover all of the extreme weather events and issues that we have. Okay, so that's what I really wanted to relay there. The other opportunity here in eastern Nebraska, water use by wheat is about 16 to 18 inches in that growing season. Corn and soybeans is about 20 to 24. So there's opportunity to grow something after wheat with the water we get in this part of the state in terms of forage crop, double crop, cover crop, other things to improve soil health. Other things in terms of resiliency that I just wanted to mention. I'm going to read a few titles here. This is from 24 through about 2015, 2024 through about 2015 for studies. A lot of studies looking at the resilience of different crop rotations in the US. So one of those studies, a rotational complexity increases cropping system output under poor growing conditions. So remember in southeast Nebraska, Paul had found 18 bushel yield increase with wheat in the rotation, but over in Illinois, I said 10. Right? We don't always get the rain that they do in Illinois. So in terms of poor growing conditions, that's part of what that difference is there, was just limitations in water. Long-term evidence shows that crop rotation diversification increases ag resiliency to adverse growing conditions in North America. So again, inherently building resiliency with diverse crop rotation. Increased crop diversity mitigates weather variation and improves yield stability across our production system in the United States. Corn and soybean yields and returns are greater in rotation with wheat. Okay, so adding wheat there's study after study that's either it's neutral or positive to adding wheat to the rotation, but at least in eastern Nebraska, it's not a tool that we're using to build resilience, to improve soil health. And I think in terms of a unique trait to wheat is an opportunity where there's not existing all this other wheat if you were trying to isolate that in the food chain, for example. Rationale and motivation. So there's a really interesting study done in 2019 that looked at North Dakota, South Dakota, and Nebraska. And so part of production isn't just agronomics, right? It's families, farms, it's life decisions. How many decisions are you going to make today? A lot, if you really think about it. Do I need to slip out and use the restroom while Nathan's talking still, right? But there's such thing as decision fatigue on the farm, right? You can be overwhelmed at the amount of decisions. Adding another crop, guess what? That adds decisions over two. You're making things a little bit more complicated. And when you're already stressed, what do you want to do? Not have to make more decisions. And so these are real human factors in terms of management on the farm. Okay, so they found that producers were 1.8 more likely to adopt crop rotation if they perceive that crop rotation to improve profitability. That makes sense. Profitability is going to drive that decision. But perceptions, okay? I'm actually have to slip out when we're done here. I'm going to be talking to the Nature Conservancy and farmers and partners over in Grand Island about this, where I'll get into the specific economics that's inherently At least the data I've seen, that's not true in our current price scenario as of today, okay, in the current commodity prices. The other main barrier to adoption to crop rotation is the lack of time or resources. The surveyors didn't separate out those two. I wish they would have in their question. To me, that's two separate questions. So if you're a sociologist or psychologist, I wish you would have worked with this group to split that apart. But I think inherently from growers I've talked to, it's time, especially time in the fall. When you need to be harvesting corn and soybeans, you also need to be planting wheat. So there's a time crunch that time of year. In the spring, you're actually reducing your workload because that's a few less acres of corn or soybeans to plant. But now we have to have wheat harvest in the summer, so you increase. So you're shifting workload, but there is some time commitment there as well. One thing that I've noticed, remember Northeast Nebraska, they've never grown wheat. So they have no generational knowledge of wheat production. So they don't even know, honestly, talk to farmers, they do not know roughly even what realistic yield goals are for their area. And that's why they had been calling me. Can I get 50 bushel wheat? I'm like, yeah, totally. Right? You should be getting a lot more than that. So in terms of yield, and this is part of the reason for the decrease in wheat planted acres in Southeast and East Central Nebraska. Remember I showed how much we were producing, 500,000 down to about 30,000. Corn and soybean yields have gone up. Breeders did an excellent job in a certain time frame where wheat was kind of stagnant. So from about 1970 to about the mid-1990s, the average yields in Eastern Nebraska in these three crop reporting districts was about 38 bushels an acre. And corn and soybean yields per acre per year were going up. So you start running the economics back then, you're like, yeah, I'm going to start growing more and more corn and soybeans, less wheat because it's more profitable, less profitable to grow wheat. What people haven't kept up, and even farmers in Southeast Nebraska, I've worked with a lot of younger producers, 20s, 30s, 40s, that are growing wheat, have added wheat to the operation, and they've never grown it themselves. They say, oh, talk to their parents, oh yeah, we used to produce wheat. You know, we were 30, 40 bushel, and that number is still in their head. We've gone up about a bushel per acre per year from about 2000 till now. So almost a 30 bushel increase here in Eastern Nebraska. So when we talk about economics and realistic yield goals, that's important. The other thing, prices are better than farmers know in Eastern Nebraska. Because of our proximity to rail and water, our basis, which is the difference between the futures price and the local cash price the farmer gets, is closer together. As you get further away or it's harder to move that grain, it costs you more. If you're in Southeast Nebraska, and Royce could talk about this even more than me, where is that going to go? We have to move that to the Pacific Northwest Gulf Coast, and it's a long ways, and it's not necessarily as close to rail or water as it would be here in Lincoln or along the Missouri River. So this is the difference in price that a farmer would get here in Lancaster County for their wheat versus Southwest Nebraska on a given day, or at least when I had looked it up. Okay. Other implications, management missteps. That's probably one of the main ones that I've worked on the last 10 years is helping mitigate management missteps the first year. If you're trying to learn a new skill and it's not going right at the beginning, are you going to keep trying to learn it? You're more likely to quit. What happens if you have success on learning a new skill right away? You're likely to stick with it. It's the same thing when we talk about growing a new crop. So working with farmers to be successful year one in growing wheat has been a huge hurdle or issue I've worked on that has really had an impact. So education and training. Weed control and herbicide costs can be reduced with wheat. Manure management, we don't have any cattle in Nebraska, right? Right? In terms of manure management, actually adding flexibility of being able to apply that manure during summer months, not just spring or fall, can really help operations. Double crop or forage crops after wheat. Straw is worth money in Eastern Nebraska, about $100 a ton. And yeah, we're removing carbon, but in that type of rotation, we can still be sustainable with removing some of it. Potential for nitrogen credit with cover crops. So lowering the amount of nitrogen fertilizer we need to apply to achieve the same yield. And then the other one is cost share. So there is cost share through NRCS as through two different federal programs called EQIP and CSP. I won't go into the names, but essentially farmers could get $12 to $5 an acre to add wheat to the rotation. And most farmers would be like, not worth it. at that money. And so that's just the reality of where we're at. I think for FY25, there's an option coming depending on how things go, but that might be significantly higher here in the near future in Nebraska anyway. Okay, so I'm excited about that. And I think that wraps up. So I'm sure I went a little long, but I think we were ahead of schedule. So questions, Steve?
We have time for one question. And while you're thinking of your question, I do want to acknowledge the Nebraska Wheat Board for sponsoring this roundtable and the Nebraska Wheat Growers Association. So when you go out to your break, be sure to thank Royce. Okay, do we have questions? We have one there. Anyone else?
So actually got two quick questions. So I grew up on a farm quite a few years ago, so things may have changed a lot. But one of the things that we quit raising wheat was because in eastern Nebraska, because it was not infrequent at all that just before harvest, we get enough rain that would flatten the crop. It would flatten the crop, so it made it hard to harvest. Have we had changes to make the stem stronger to avoid that problem? And secondly, is the benefit that we see in the crop yields following wheat, is that hold true if you double crop? Like, you know, some people do soybeans after wheat. Is there something that requires more time for that improvement to occur? Does double cropping achieve those same increased yields?
Two great questions. The first question on standability or resistance to lodging was a problem here in eastern Nebraska with our higher rainfall. We generally get more biomass and growth and more yield potential, which puts more stress on the stem. The breeders have done a great job of breeding for standability. There are varieties farmers can plant that regularly, most of the time, is not an issue. Have I had growers pick the wrong variety, not adapted to our area, and have lodging issues? Yes. So what variety you pick is a large driver in that being a risk anymore. But there's adapted varieties with excellent standability here for the East. So kudos to the wheat breeders. Yeah. Okay. And the second question on growing something after wheat, in terms of water, growing something after wheat versus not would affect how much probably soil moisture is available for the next spring, because that double crop after wheat or cover crop, forage crop would use some of that water. So yes, you would lose maybe some of the yield benefits, but just the rotational benefit in terms of disease, pest, soil health is still there. So there's still a large chunk of that is you're still going to see. And it would largely be driven by what we get for moisture. If it's, like I said, 10 bushel versus 18 bushel in a dry year, and you didn't plant anything after wheat, it could be 20 bushel better corn. In a wet year, we're going to probably be closer to that Illinois, that 10 bushel. Yeah.